Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. This phrase echoes across a galaxy torn apart by endless conflict, where ancient empires clash against alien horrors, where humanity clings to survival through faith and fury, and where the very fabric of reality bleeds with the violence of a million battlefields. It's a universe where hope is a fragile thing, where mercy is seen as weakness, and where the most unlikely connections can form in the spaces between bolter rounds and the screams of the dying. This is a story about such a connection, a story that shouldn't exist in the brutal logic of the 41st millennium, a tale of an orc, a greenskin warrior born for violence, and a space marine dreadnought, an entombed hero cursed with a half-life of eternal battle. Their meeting was written in blood and fire, as all meetings are in this dark age. But what came after defied everything the Imperium of man teaches, everything orc culture celebrates, and everything the galaxy expects from two beings who should have been nothing more than enemies until death claimed one or both. To understand how impossible this friendship was, we first need to understand the universe that birthed it. The Warhammer 40,000 setting is not kind to its inhabitants. Humanity exists under the decaying corpse throne of the God Emperor, a being who has sat unmoving for 10,000 years, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychic souls every single day. His Imperium stretches across 1,000,000 worlds, each one a fortress against the darkness, each one a monument to suffering and sacrifice. The Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, are his angels of death, and genetically engineered super soldiers who know no fear and show no mercy to the enemies of mankind. And there are so many enemies. The galaxy teems with them, chaos cultists who worship dark gods in the Imperium, offering their souls for power and their sanity for forbidden knowledge. Tyranids, an extragalactic swarm of bioengineered horrors that consume entire worlds, leaving nothing but barren rock in their wake. The Eldar, ancient and arrogant, whose dying civilization plays games with the fates of lesser species. The Tau, idealistic newcomers who preach of a greater good while expanding their empire with disturbing efficiency. And the Necrons, machine gods older than human civilization, stirring from millions of years of slumber to reclaim a galaxy they once ruled. But perhaps no race embodies the sheer or mindless violence of this dark millennium quite like the orcs. They are a fungal species, spreading through spores that take root wherever they fall, growing from small Gretchen to towering war bosses through constant combat. Their entire culture, if you can call it that, revolves around fighting. They fight because fighting is fun. They fight because fighting makes sense. They fight because when you're an orc, fighting is literally encoded into every cell of your body, every thought in your simple but effective mind, every beat of your oversized heart. Orcs don't build civilizations in any human sense. They create warbands, massive migrations of violence that sweep across systems, leaving devastation in their wake. They call these crusades wars, a word that is simultaneously a war cry, a philosophy, and a psychic phenomenon that binds greenskin society together. When enough orcs gather in one place, their collective belief in their own superiority actually warps reality, making their ramshackle weapons work better, their crude armor more protective, and their painted vehicles faster if they're red, because everyone knows red goes faster. This Gestalt psychic field means that orc technology shouldn't work, but it does anyway, held together by equal parts scrap metal, optimism, and the unshakable belief that if you paint it the right color and make enough noise, any machine will do what you want. Their mech boys, the closest thing orcs have to engineers, build vehicles that would make an imperial tech priest weep with horror. Guns that shoot more bullets than should physically fit in their magazines. Boss engines that run on fuel that hasn't been refined, just scooped up and thrown into tanks. Force fields generated by spinning plates of metal that somehow deflect laser fire. In this chaotic, violent, impossibly brutal universe, our story begins. Not with grand proclamations or destiny written in the stars, but with a battle. Because in the 41st millennium, every story begins with a battle. Every tale of heroism starts with blood. Every legend is born in fire. The nature of a walking tomb. Before we dive into the heart of our tale, we need to understand what a dreadnought truly is. Not just the surface level, the walking tank aspect that most citizens of the Imperium see, but the terrible reality of what it means to be interred in one of these ancient machines. Because understanding the dreadnought is understanding half of our impossible friendship. Imagine you are a space marine, not just any human, but one of the Emperor's finest warriors, chosen from billions to undergo the painful process of transformation. They took you as a child, perhaps no more than 10 or 12 years old, and over the course of years they rebuilt your body. They implanted a second heart to pump blood with superhuman efficiency. They gave you extra lungs that can breathe toxic atmospheres. They fused an additional organ to your ribcage that can spit acid. They hardened your bones with ceramite weave, modified your brain to process information faster than any baseline human could comprehend, and added 19 different gene seed organs that slowly, agonizingly, transformed you from a child into a post-human warrior standing 8 feet tall in armor that weighs as much as a small vehicle. The process kills most candidates. Their bodies reject the organs, or the chemical treatments prove too much for their systems, or the hypno-indoctrination breaks their minds. But you survived. You became a scout, learning the arts of war from brothers who have fought for centuries. You earned your power armor, that sacred suit of ceramite and plasteel that turns you from merely superhuman into something approaching divine. You fought in campaigns across a dozen worlds. You watched brothers fall and new recruits rise to take their places. You served the Emperor with every fiber of your enhanced being, knowing that you would likely die in service to him, but accepting that fate with the grim determination that defines the Adeptus Astartes. Now imagine that death finds you, but it doesn't finish the job. A plasma bolt melts through your armor, destroying your legs and half your torso. An orc power claw tears through your chest, rupturing organs that no amount of imperial medical science can repair. A tyrannid bioweapon dissolves your body from the inside out, leaving you a screaming wreck of barely living tissue. You should die. You want to die. Death would be mercy, would be peace after a life of endless war. But your chapter doesn't let you die, because you're too valuable, too experienced, too skilled to simply allow you to pass into the Emperor's grace. Instead, they take what's left of your broken body, that shriveled, ruined core of flesh that still contains your consciousness, and they place it inside a sarcophagus. This armored shell becomes your new body, a claustrophobic coffin that keeps your ruined flesh alive through chemical infusions and mechanical life support. They wire your nervous system directly into the machine, connecting what remains of your spine to servos and actuators, linking your eyes to optical sensors, your ears to audio receptors, your sense of touch to pressure sensors mounted on metal limbs. Then they seal you inside a dreadnought chassis. Suddenly, you stand 12 feet tall instead of 8. Your arms are no longer arms, but weapon mounts, assault cannons, and missile launchers, and power fists the size of small vehicles. Your legs are reverse-jointed mechanical pillars that can crush tanks underfoot. Your body, your actual body, is somewhere deep inside this walking fortress. But you can't see it, can't touch it, can't feel anything except the cold efficiency of machine spirits and targeting data flowing through your consciousness. You are no longer fully alive, but you're not dead either. You exist in a twilight state, trapped between mortality and the eternal sleep you crave. The tech marines of your chapter call it an honor, this preservation of your service. The chaplains speak of your duty, how you continue to serve even beyond the death that should have claimed you. Your battle brothers revere you, calling you Ancient One and Venerable. treating you with a respect usually reserved for the chapter's most sacred relics. But inside the sarcophagus, you know the truth. This is a prison, a gilded cage that extends your service not out of honor, but because the knowledge and experience locked inside your mind is too valuable to lose. The chapter needs warriors who remember battles from centuries ago, who can provide tactical wisdom gathered across dozens of campaigns, who carry memories of how the chapter fought when their Primarch still walked among them. So they wake you when they need you. When a threat emerges that requires your specific expertise, when a battle demands firepower that only a Dreadnought can provide, when the chapter faces a challenge that only your accumulated wisdom can address. You stomp onto the battlefield, your assault cannon roaring, your power fist crushing everything in your path. And for those brief hours of combat, you almost feel alive again. The rush of battle, the clarity of purpose, the simple satisfaction of destroying the Emperor's enemies. These moments remind you of what you once were, when you had hands that could grip a bolter, legs that could charge into melee, a mouth that could shout the chapter's battle cries. But then the battle ends. Your ammunition runs dry, the enemies lie dead around you, and the Tech Marines come to escort you back to the chapter's fortress monastery. Back to the chambers where Dreadnoughts sleep between battles, suspended in stasis fields that shut down all unnecessary functions, plunging you into a darkness that isn't quite sleep and isn't quite death. Time means nothing in this state. You close your optical sensors on one battlefield and open them on another, decades or even centuries later, with no sense of how much time has passed. Your memories begin to fade, not the tactical data, not the combat experience that the chapter values so highly, but the human memories. The face of your mother becomes hazy. The names of your squad mates from your first campaign slip away. The smell of your homeworld's forests, the taste of the feast after your first successful mission, the feeling of sun on skin that you no longer have, all of these fade like morning mist under harsh light. You're becoming less human with each awakening, more machine, until eventually you fear that nothing will remain of the man you once were except programming and targeting protocols. This is the existence of a Dreadnought, a hero preserved beyond death, but at the cost of everything that made him a person. A warrior whose service never ends, even when he desperately craves the rest that death would bring. A talking monument to the Imperium's refusal to let its heroes rest, because the galaxy is too dangerous and the enemies too numerous to afford the luxury of allowing the experienced to die with dignity. Some Dreadnoughts are ancient beyond measure, like Bjorn the Fell-Handed of the Space Wolves, who fought beside the Emperor's sons during the Great Crusade 10,000 years ago. He wakes perhaps once every century, spending decades or longer in that dreamless sleep, and when he does wake, the stories he tells are of a time that seems mythical even to other Space Marines. Others are more recently interred, still clinging to their humanity, still remembering what it felt like to be flesh and blood, still hoping that maybe, just maybe, the next battle will be the one that grants them the death they seek. That the Imperium sees Dreadnoughts as symbols of hope, of the idea that service to the Emperor never truly ends, that even death cannot stop a true hero from defending humanity. But the pilots inside these metal tombs often see themselves differently, as prisoners, as ghosts, as men who should have been allowed to rest, but instead are forced to wake again and again to fight battles for a future they'll never live to see. And it was one of these walking tombs, one of these imprisoned heroes, who would form the most unlikely friendship in Imperial history. But to understand how a creature of pure violence could connect with a warrior cursed to eternal service, we need to understand orcs not as the simple monsters the Imperium paints them to be, but as the bizarre, brutal, and surprisingly complex species they truly are. What the Green Tide and its warriors. Orcs are not born, they spawn. This fundamental difference separates them from almost every other intelligent species in the galaxy. There are no orc children playing in the mud, no orc mothers teaching their offspring to walk, no orc elders passing down wisdom to the next generation. Instead, orcs reproduce through a spore-based life cycle that would fascinate any Imperial biologist. If studying Xenos biology weren't considered borderline heretical in most segments of the Imperium. When an orc dies, or even when an orc simply exists in one place for long enough, microscopic spores spread into the environment. These spores are remarkably resilient, able to survive in almost any conditions from frozen tundra to radioactive wastelands. They take root in soil, in caves, in the ruins of destroyed buildings, as anywhere they can find the slightest bit of organic material to feed on, and then they grow. First come the smallest subspecies, the snotlings. These mushroom-like creatures stand perhaps a foot tall, barely intelligent enough to follow simple commands, useful primarily for tending the fungal gardens that will feed the next generation. After the snotlings establish themselves, the Gretchen emerge. These are the orc worker caste, standing 3 to 4 feet tall, cowardly and cruel in equal measure, smart enough to operate simple machinery, but too weak to challenge their larger cousins for dominance. And finally, the orcs themselves sprout from the fungal mass. They emerge fully formed, already several feet tall, possessed of instinctive knowledge that's encoded genetically into their very structure. Or an orc knows how to fight from the moment it pulls itself from the spawning ground. It knows the hierarchy of orc society, knows that bigger is better, knows that fighting and winning makes you grow bigger and stronger. It knows without being taught that red vehicles go faster, that more dakka is always better than less dakka, and that the best time to fight is right now. This instinctive knowledge extends to their various castes. Some orcs emerge with a natural understanding of machinery, becoming mech boys who can build vehicles and weapons from scrap metal and wishful thinking. Others find themselves drawn to medicine, if you can call orc surgery medicine, becoming pain boys who can reattach severed limbs with a few nails and some medical glue that's probably just regular glue. Some become weird boys, are psychers who channel the collective psychic energy of the greenskin race, often exploding spectacularly when too many orcs gather nearby. But most orcs are boys, simple warriors whose entire purpose in life is fighting. They live for the thrill of combat, the rush of adrenaline when they charge into enemy fire, the satisfaction of crushing a foe under their boots or splitting them in half with a chopper. This isn't because they're evil in any human sense. Orcs don't hate their enemies. They don't fight for ideology or revenge or the conquest of resources. They fight because fighting makes them happy. It's the most fun thing an orc can do, and the only real tragedy in an orc's life is dying before you get into a proper scrap. This love of violence combines with their unique biology to create a species that's perfectly designed for eternal warfare. When an orc fights and survives, it literally grows larger and stronger. The biggest, meanest orc in a group naturally becomes the leader, not through any election or hereditary right, but simply because he's proven he's the best at the one thing orcs care about, crumping other things. These bosses can grow to immense sizes, 8 or 9 feet tall, even before they strap on their crude armor, with muscles like cable and skin thick enough to turn aside knives. The most successful bosses attract followers, building a warband from the orcs who respect their ability to find good fights. As the warband grows, so does the psychic field generated by so many orcs in one place. This field, or this collective belief in orc superiority, begins to affect reality itself. Suddenly their guns, which shouldn't work based on any understanding of physics, start firing anyway because the orcs believe they should work. Their armor, made from scrap metal bolted together, becomes strangely effective at stopping bullets. Their vehicles, powered by engines that should explode on ignition, roar to life and charge into battle at speeds that would make an Imperial Guard commander weep with envy. When a truly powerful boss emerges, one who's the biggest and meanest orc on an entire planet or even across multiple systems, he can trigger something called a Great Crusade. Millions of orcs unite under his banner, drawn by an instinctive need to be part of something proper big. They pile into space hulks, those massive conglomerations of fused ships that drift through the warp and set off to find new worlds to fight on. They crash land on planets with all the subtlety of a meteor strike, spill out of their ramshackle transports, and start fighting everything in sight. The Imperium has fought orcs since before there was an Imperium. The Emperor himself, during the Unification Wars on ancient Terra, battled orc warlords in the radioactive wastes of old Earth. During the Great Crusade, when the Emperor's Space Marine legions spread across the galaxy, they encountered massive orc empires that had to be destroyed world by world, exterminated down to the last spore to prevent them from rising again. The greatest of these was the Ullanor Crusade, where War Master Horus faced an orc empire so vast it threatened to swallow entire sectors of space. But here's the thing about orcs that makes them so terrifying, so unstoppable. You can never truly eliminate them. Every battlefield where orcs fought becomes seeded with their spores. Every planet they invaded remains infested for centuries, new generations of greenskins emerging from the wilderness to raid imperial settlements. The Imperium has been fighting orcs for 10,000 years, and they'll be fighting them for 10,000 more, because you can't kill an idea, and orcs are an idea made flesh. The idea that fighting is the best thing in the universe, and everything else is just waiting for the next fight to start. Most orcs are straightforward creatures. They see something, they fight it, they move on to the next fight. But occasionally, very occasionally, an orc is different. Maybe a genetic quirk in the spawning, or maybe exposure to something unusual, maybe just random chance in a galaxy that thrives on chaos. These orcs think a bit more than their fellows. They're still violent, still obsessed with fighting, but they approach combat with something approaching strategy. They collect trophies from worthy opponents. They remember particularly good scraps years later and tell stories about them around campfires built from the wreckage of enemy vehicles. These are the orcs who become legendary, the ones like Gazakul Mag Uruk Thraka, whose crusade nearly destroyed the planet Armageddon. The ones like Tusker, the demon killer, who was so obsessed with fighting chaos demons that he flew his entire warband into the Eye of Terror, where, according to legend, they fight and die and resurrect every single day for eternity in the ultimate orc paradise. Yet the ones who leave their mark on history, not just as another green tide to be stopped, but as individuals who changed the galaxy through their actions. Our story involves one of these unusual orcs, not a legendary warboss whose name echoes across sectors, not a figure that will be remembered in imperial histories, just an orc who was different enough from his fellows to do something that no orc in recorded history had ever done. Something that would seem impossible to both Imperium and Greenskin alike. He became friends with the enemy, but before that friendship could begin, before these two impossible individuals could meet, there needed to be a battle. And in the grim darkness of the far future, battles are never in short supply. The Battle of Gorkon's Ridge. The world of Corvus III hung in the void like a grey pearl, its surface scarred by centuries of mining operations that had stripped away the lush forests and deep oceans that once covered its continents. Now, it was a landscape of industrial hives and vast strip mines, home to 17 billion imperial citizens who toiled in the refineries that processed rare earths for the Adeptus Mechanicus. It was an ugly world, polluted and scarred, but it was productive. And in the Imperium of Man, productivity was worth far more than beauty. The orc invasion came without warning, as orc invasions usually do. A space hulk emerged from the warp on the system's edge, its mass so great that it disrupted orbital patterns throughout Corvus, the third solar system. Before the Imperial Navy could mobilize a response, crude landing craft detached from the hulk's bulk like spores from a dying tree, plummeting toward the planet's surface with reckless abandon. Many burned up in atmosphere. Others crashed into mountains or oceans, their passengers killed instantly. But enough survived, and from those survivors, the invasion began. The orcs called their boss Warlord Grimskull, and he was everything an orc boss should be. 12 feet tall in his mega armor, covered in scars from 100 battles, with a power claw that could tear through a tank's armor like paper. He'd united 3 different orc clans under his banner through the simple expedient of being bigger and meaner than any other boss in the system where he'd spawned. Now he led his crusade to Farthest III, drawn by some instinct that told him this world would provide proper good fighting. The Imperium responded as it always does when Xenos threaten one of its worlds. And the Imperial Guard regiments stationed on Farthest III mobilized, their millions of soldiers digging trenches and setting up artillery emplacements. The planetary defense forces were activated, local militias given laser guns and prayer books and told to hold the line against the Green Tide. And the call went out to the Adeptus Astartes, requesting aid from any chapter close enough to respond before the planet fell. The Crimson Castellans answered that call. It was a relatively young chapter, founded in the 36th millennium as part of some long-forgotten founding, their gene seed drawn from the lineage of Rogel Dawn and the Imperial Fists. They specialized in siege warfare and defensive operations, making them ideal for the kind of grinding combat that an orc invasion inevitably became. Their battle barge, the Adamant Shield, and translated into real space 3 weeks after the invasion began, carrying 2 full companies of Space Marines ready to push back the Green Tide. Among those Space Marines was Brother Ancient Castor of the Crimson Castellans' First Company. He had been a warrior of the chapter for 237 years before his injury. A Chaos Warp bolt had torn through his chest cavity during the defense of Shrine World Benedictus, destroying both his hearts and most of his internal organs. The apothecaries who found him said that only his enhanced Space Marine physiology had kept him alive long enough to reach the medical bay. Any normal human would have died instantly from such wounds. But Castor did not die. Instead, he was interred in a Dreadnought chassis, a Castroferrum pattern, Mark V that had served the chapter for nearly 3,000 years. 6 different brothers had piloted this chassis before him, their names inscribed on armor plates that covered the ancient machine. Now Castor's name joined theirs, and he became Brother Ancient Castor, a walking tank, armed with an assault cannon and a power fist, 13 tons of adamantium and ceramite, and barely living flesh. He had been a Dreadnought for 83 years, long enough to grow accustomed to his metal body, but not so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be fully human. He still remembered his mother's face, still recalled the taste of the feast after he'd completed his training as a scout. The memories were fading, growing hazier with each awakening, but they remained. Sometimes he wished they'd fade faster, but it would be easier to accept this half-life if he couldn't remember what he'd lost. The Crimson Castellans deployed to the northern continent of Farthest III, where Warlord Grimskull's main force had concentrated. The orcs had overrun 3 major hive cities, slaughtering millions of Imperial citizens and turning the hives into fortresses from which they launched raids across the continent. The Imperial Guard had managed to establish a defensive line along a mountain range called Gorkon's Ridge, after the Departamento Cartographic's finest efforts to pronounce the native name in Low Gothic. It was here that the Space Marines would make their stand. Brother Ancient Castor remembered the battle beginning with the roar of artillery, Imperial basilisks and orc big guns trading fire across the valley floor. And he remembered the Green Tide pouring over the ridge, thousands upon thousands of boys charging the Imperial lines with their choppers raised high, bellowing their war cries. He remembered his assault cannon spinning up, the familiar vibration traveling through his chassis as hundreds of mass-reactive shells tore into the orc horde, each impact detonating inside green flesh and turning individual orcs into clouds of red mist. The battle raged for 6 hours. 6 hours of continuous combat, of ammunition feeding belts running dry and being replaced by servitors, of his power fist crushing orc bodies by the dozen, of his optical sensors tracking hundreds of targets and prioritizing threats with the cold efficiency of machine spirits. Space Marines fought alongside him, as their blue and silver armor standing out against the grey stone of the mountains. Imperial guardsmen died by the thousands, their flak armor no match for orc weapons. But they held the line anyway because the commissars shot anyone who retreated. And then something went wrong. An orc big mech, one of those rare greenskins who combined mechanical genius with surprising tactical acumen, had managed to flank the Imperial position. A column of orc vehicles burst from a canyon the Imperial forces had thought too narrow for tanks, catching the defenders from the side. Battle wagons and trucks filled with boys crashed into the Imperial line, breaking the defensive formation, and suddenly the battle became a chaotic melee instead of an organized defense. Castor found himself separated from his chapter brothers, cut off by a tide of green bodies that surged between him and the rest of the Crimson Castellans. He fought alone, his assault cannon never stopping, his power fist crushing anything that came close. Dozens of orcs fell around him, then hundreds, their bodies piling high enough to slow his advance through the churned mud and blood of the battlefield. But there were always more orcs. They came at him in waves, caring nothing for the bodies of their fallen comrades, laughing even as his weapons tore them apart. Some carried rockets that exploded against his armor, blackening the ceramite but not penetrating it. Others wielded massive choppers, crude axes that could cleave through lesser armor but broke against his dreadnought shell. A few of the bigger orcs, knobs in mega armor, actually posed a threat, their power claws sparking against his hull as they tried to tear through to the vulnerable sarcophagus within. He killed them all, but the effort cost him. His assault cannon finally ran dry, the ammunition feeds empty, the barrel glowing cherry red from continuous fire. His power fist's power cell depleted, reducing it to a simple mechanical claw instead of the reality-shearing weapon it had been. Damage warnings scrolled across his vision as minor systems failed, hit by lucky shots or simply worn down by the hours of combat. He was still functional, still dangerous, but weakened. That's when Warlord Grimskull himself joined the battle. The massive orc warlord crashed through the melee, his power claw raised high, bellowing a challenge that Castor's audio receptors picked up even over the din of combat. The warlord wanted a proper fight, a showdown between the biggest fighters on each side, the way Orc honor demanded. Castor would have been happy to oblige, to crush this Xenos leader and scatter his forces. But he never got the chance. A dreadnought is nearly immune to small arms fire, but it has vulnerabilities. The joints where legs connect to torso, the ammunition feeds that supply its weapons, the power cables that run beneath armor plates, and most critically, the ground beneath its feet. Dreadnoughts are heavy, 13 tons or more depending on the pattern, and that weight can be turned against them with the right tactics.
You know, I have to pause here for a moment because this story really makes me think about what we value in the Warhammer universe. We're so used to the Imperium being the good guys by default, right? But when you really examine what they do to their heroes, taking mortally wounded warriors and trapping them in metal coffins for centuries of service, it's honestly horrifying. I've been covering 40K lores for quite a while. And the more I dig into Dreadnought stories, the more I realize they're not tales of honor, they're tragedies. And the fact that it takes an orc of all things to show genuine compassion to one of these warriors, that's what makes this story so compelling to me. It challenges everything we think we know about this universe. But anyway, back to Castor and Grimskull's story.
The orcs didn't use tactics, not usually, but Grimskull's big mech, the one who'd led the flanking attack, understood weakness. He'd placed charges in the ground, demolition packs salvaged from Imperial munitions and rigged to explode on command. When Castor stepped into the kill zone, pursuing a group of boys who were falling back, the big mech triggered the charges. The explosion threw Castor sideways, 12 feet of armored warrior toppling like a felled tree. His gyros screamed warnings as he crashed into the rocky ground, his right leg torn away at the knee joint by the blast, hydraulic fluid spraying across the battlefield. He tried to rise, tried to bring his remaining weapons to bear, but without a leg he couldn't balance, couldn't stand. He was reduced to dragging himself forward with his power fist, carving furrows in the mud, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been since his interment. The orcs swarmed him, They clambered over his chassis like ants on a fallen warrior, and their crude tools trying to pry open armor plates, their rockets detonating against his hull at point-blank range. Caster fought them off as best he could, crushing any orc that came within reach of his power fist. But there were too many. For every greenskin he killed, 3 more took its place. He could feel his systems failing, damage accumulating faster than his self-repair mechanisms could compensate. This was it, he realized. After 83 years as a Dreadnought, after 237 years as a Space Marine, this is how his story would end. Overwhelmed by orcs on some forgettable mining world, his chassis torn apart, his sarcophagus breached, his half-life finally ended by Xenos weapons. Part of him felt relieved. Death had been denied to him for so long that its arrival felt almost welcome. Or at least he wouldn't have to wake up again, wouldn't have to face another century trapped in this metal shell. But death didn't come. Instead, through the haze of damage warnings and failing sensors, Caster heard a bellow in crude Gothic. The orcs attacking him suddenly stopped, pulled back by their fellows. And then Warlord Grimskull himself stood over the fallen Dreadnought, his massive form blocking out the smoke-filled sky. The Warlord didn't kill him. Instead, he barked orders in the orc tongue, a language Caster's autosenses couldn't translate, but whose intent was clear from context. The other orcs backed away, confused but obedient. Grimskull himself grabbed Caster's chassis with his power claw, the massive mechanical claw clamping around the Dreadnought's torso, and began dragging it away from the battlefield. In that moment, and as consciousness faded due to damage and system shutdowns, Caster understood that something worse than death had found him. He was being captured, taken as a prize by the Orc Warlord, and whatever fate awaited him in Orc hands would be far crueler than a warrior's death on the battlefield ever could have been. The fortress of scrap and dreams. Consciousness returned slowly, like rising through deep water toward a distant light. Brother Ancient Caster's systems came online one by one, each subsystem reporting its status with the cold efficiency of machine spirits. Power core, functional at 47% capacity. Primary sensors, online but degraded. Motor control, severely compromised. Right leg actuator, destroyed. Assault cannon, ammunition depleted. Power fist, functional but unpowered. Sarcophagus, integrity, stable. And that last readout brought a mixture of relief and disappointment. His body, what little remained of it, was intact within the armored shell that kept him alive. He hadn't been torn apart by greenskins eager to see what made the metal Hume work. But relief gave way quickly to the realization of what this meant. He was still alive, still trapped in this half-existence, and now in enemy hands. He activated his optical sensors and immediately wished he hadn't. The sight that greeted him was something from a tech marine's nightmares. He was in what could generously be called a workshop, though it bore no resemblance to the ordered precision of the Crimson Castellan's armory. The space was vast, easily 100 meters across, carved into the side of a mountain and open to the elements on one side. Crude walls made from welded scrap metal and sheets of plasteel formed the other 3 sides, covered in orc glyphs that his auto-senses couldn't translate. The floor was a chaos of parts and pieces. Tank treads lay next to what appeared to be a chimera's engine block. Bolters, their sacred machine spirits desecrated by crude orc modifications, were piled in corners alongside orc shooters and sluggers. Barrels of fuel, ammunition crates, power cells, armor plates from a dozen different sources, all of it jumbled together without any organizational system Caster could discern. The smell, even filtered through his air intake sensors, was overwhelming. A mixture of oil, blood, fungus, and something acrid that might have been orc body odor. And everywhere, orcs. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds in the larger complex this workshop connected to. They bustled about with surprising purpose, carrying tools and parts, arguing over the best way to fix some ramshackle vehicle, occasionally stopping to brawl with each other before returning to work, as if the fight had been just another form of conversation. These were mech boys and their assistants, the engineer caste of Orc Society, and they were treating the captured Dreadnought like the most fascinating toy they'd ever seen. Castor tried to move, to rise, or at least shift his position, but his damaged leg made anything beyond small adjustments impossible. He was propped against a wall, his chassis held in place by massive chains that looked like they'd been salvaged from Imperial shipping containers. The chains were probably unnecessary given his damage, but orcs never did anything by half measures. And if you were going to secure something, you secured it proper good. A face appeared in his visual field, green and grotesque, with tusks that jutted from a massive jaw and red eyes that glowed with what might have been curiosity or might have been madness. The orc was smaller than Grimskull, probably only 8 feet tall, but still massive by human standards. His head was partially mechanical, one eye replaced by a crude optical sensor that whirred and clicked as it focused on Castor's optical lenses. This must be the big mech, Castor realized, the one who'd orchestrated the trap that brought him down. "Oi!" the big mech shouted, his voice so loud it distorted Castor's audio receptors. "The metal Humie's awake! Grimskull, get over here!" More faces appeared, other orcs drawn by the commotion. They pressed close, examining Castor's chassis with the same intensity a tech marine might give to a newly discovered STC fragment. Their massive hands touched his armor, feeling the ceramite, tracing the battle damage, poking at exposed cables with surprising gentleness. These weren't the mindless boys who'd swarmed him on the battlefield. These were craftsmen, in their own crude way, and they were examining a piece of technology far beyond their normal experience. Heavy footsteps announced Warlord Grimskull's arrival before the massive orc pushed through the crowd of mech boys. He stood directly in front of Castor, his arms crossed, his scarred face split by what might have been a smile, or might have been a sneer. It was hard to tell with orcs. "So," Grimskull said, his Gothic surprisingly clear if heavily accented. "The big metal Humie's still working? Good. Oh, it would have been a waste if you broke completely." Castor said nothing. His Voxcaster was functional. He could speak if he wanted. But what would he say to a Xenos warlord? What words could bridge the gulf between a space marine and an orc? Better to remain silent, to observe, to wait for an opportunity to either escape or die trying. But Grimskull didn't seem bothered by the silence. He circled around Castor's chassis, examining it from all angles, occasionally tapping armor plates with his power claw's inactive fingers. The sound of metal on metal echoed through the workshop, each tap making smaller orcs flinch even as their boss showed no fear of potential retaliation. "I've fought lots of Humies," Grimskull continued, seemingly content to have a one-sided conversation. "Little ones in flak armor. They're good for a laugh but not much of a scrap. Bigger ones in powered armor. Now those are proper fights. But use metal Humies, use Dreadnoughts, use a something special." He pronounced it Dreadnoughts, slurring the syllables together in the orc fashion. It shouldn't have bothered Castor, the casual mispronunciation of his prison's designation, but somehow it did. After 83 years of being called ancient and venerable, having an orc reduce him to metal Humie felt like an additional insult on top of the greater insult of captivity. "I've fought 3 of yous before," Grimskull said, now standing directly in front of Castor again, meeting the Dreadnought's optical sensors with his own eyes. "Killed 'em all eventually. One took me a whole hour, kept smashing me boys even after we tore both its arms off. That was a proper fight, that was." The warlord paused, as if expecting a reaction. When none came, he continued. "But yous didn't go down easy. Took all me best tricks to bring you down without breaking you completely. And now I'm wondering something." Another pause. Castor remained silent, though his targeting systems couldn't help but track the warlord's position, calculating attack vectors, even though his weapons were offline and his mobility was nil. Old habits died hard, even when death would be preferable to continued existence. "See," Grimskull said, leaning closer. "I've been thinking, and I know what yous Humies say, that orcs don't think much, but I do. I think about fighting, about war, about what makes a good scrap, and I realize something. Yous metal Humies, yous got something special. Yous got, experience." He pronounced the word carefully, as if it was a human concept he'd learned but didn't fully understand. You's been fighting for longer than most humies live, right? You seen battles that'd make me boy's eyes pop with envy. And you stuck in that metal body because you's too good to just die like normal humies. Despite himself, Castor found his attention sharpening. The warlord was right, in his crude way. Experience was exactly what made dreadnoughts valuable to their chapters. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, tactical wisdom gathered across dozens of campaigns, all locked inside a brain that would otherwise have rotted to nothing decades or centuries ago. So here's what I'm wondering, Grimskull said, his tone almost conversational now. What if I don't scrap you? What if I keep you around? Not as a trophy, though you'd make a good one, but as, what you call it, a rival. Yeah, that's the word. A rival. Someone proper tough to measure meself against. The big mech, who'd been listening to this exchange with growing confusion, finally spoke up. Boss, that don't make no sense. We can't keep a humie, even a metal one. They're the enemy, innit? We're supposed to crump 'em, not chat with 'em. Grimskull spun on the mech so fast that the smaller orc stumbled backward. And when did I ask what you thought, eh? I'm the boss 'cause I'm the biggest and the meanest, which means I decide what makes sense and what don't. And I say this metal humie's too interesting to just tear apart for scrap. He turned back to Castor, and now there was something in his expression that the Dreadnought couldn't quite interpret. Not malice, not exactly. Something closer to respect? No, that couldn't be right. Orcs didn't respect their enemies. They enjoyed fighting them, certainly. They appreciated a good scrap, but respect. You's fought good, Grimskull said simply. Real good. Killed dozens of me boys without slowing down. Took me best trap and me best boys to bring you down. That deserves something better than being melted down for me next Big Mech's project. For the first time since his capture, Castor engaged his Voxcaster. His voice emerged as a mechanical rasp, filtered through speakers that had roared battle cries across a dozen worlds. Then kill me. If you appreciate how I fought, grant me a warrior's death. It's more than I expected from Xenos scum, but it would be acceptable. The workshop went silent. Every orc in the space stopped what they were doing, as shocked that the metal humie had actually spoken. Even Grimskull seemed taken aback, his eyes widening slightly before that tusked grin returned to his face. Nah, he said, that'd be a waste. Besides, I got a better idea. He gestured to the big mech, who approached with obvious reluctance. Fix him up. Not completely. I don't want him mobile enough to cause proper trouble. But patch the major damage. Get his systems working again. I want him functional. Boss, the mech protested. Do you know how much work that'll be? That's humie tech. Proper complicated stuff. I'd need parts, time, probably a dozen grots just to... Then get what you need, Grimskull interrupted. I don't care if it takes a month or a year. Fix the metal humie. That's an order. The big mech grumbled but nodded, bowed, and Grimskull gave Castor one last look before turning to leave. Don't worry, metal humie. You's gonna see plenty more fighting. Probably more than you ever did with you's humie mates. Difference is, you's gonna be seeing it my way now. And with that cryptic statement, the warlord strode out of the workshop, leaving Castor alone with a dozen confused mech boys, and the growing realization that his situation had somehow become even worse than being killed would have been. The strange mercy of the green tide. The weeks that followed were among the strangest in Castor's long existence. The big mech, who turned out to be named Zagrot, though Castor had trouble telling if that was his actual name, or just what the other orcs called him, took to the task of repairing the Dreadnought with surprising dedication. Not enthusiasm exactly. Yet the mech complained constantly, muttering about finicky humie tech, and why can't they just use bolts like normal folk, and this is why orc machines are better, they don't need all these fancy doodads. But despite the complaints, Zagrot worked. He worked with a meticulousness that Castor would have never expected from an orc. The mech carefully examined every damaged system, traced every severed cable, analyzed every broken component before attempting repairs. He sent his Gretchen assistants scurrying through the orc camp to find parts, and when suitable Imperial components couldn't be found, he fabricated orc replacements with surprising ingenuity. The first major repair was Castor's destroyed leg, and Zagrot couldn't replicate the sophisticated servo systems and micro-actuators that had allowed the original limb to move with superhuman grace. But he could build something that would work, that would bear weight and allow basic movement. The replacement leg he crafted was crude, all pistons and hydraulics and exposed gears, painted in garish red because red goes faster, even when you're just walking. It shouldn't have worked. The tolerances were wrong, the materials were inferior, the engineering was fundamentally unsound by any Imperial standard. But it did work, because orcs believed it would work. And in the mad physics of the 41st millennium, that belief was sometimes enough to override reality itself. Other repairs followed. Zagrot patched armor plates with crude welds that would have made any tech marine weep. He rerouted power cables using components that looked like they'd been salvaged from at least 3 different vehicles. He even attempted to restore Castor's assault cannon, though that proved beyond even orc ingenuity. The weapon's machine spirits had been damaged beyond repair, their sacred rituals disrupted, their connection to the Omnissiah severed. No amount of orc tinkering could restore a machine spirit once it had departed. Through all of this, Castor remained largely passive. What choice did he have? The chains still held him in place, and even if he could somehow break free, where would he go? He was deep in orc-held territory, surrounded by thousands of greenskins, with no way to contact his chapter or reach Imperial lines. Attempting to escape would be suicide, and while part of him craved the release that death would bring, as another part, the part that had kept him fighting for over 300 years, wasn't ready to give up yet. So he observed. He watched the orcs go about their daily lives, which primarily consisted of fighting each other, working on vehicles, eating massive quantities of food, and then fighting again. The orc social structure became clearer through observation. Grimskull ruled through a combination of size and success in battle. But beneath him was a surprisingly complex hierarchy. The big mech Zagrot held status not through violence, but through his ability to build things that worked. Other knobs, smaller than Grimskull, but still massive by orc standards, commanded groups of boys and competed with each other for status within the warband. What surprised Castor most was that the orcs weren't constantly at each other's throats. Yes, they fought frequently, brawls breaking out over perceived slights or simply boredom, but these fights were rarely to the death. An orc would get knocked down, declare the other bloke had won this round, and then they'd both go back to whatever they'd been doing before. No hard feelings. It was violence without true malice, combat as a form of communication rather than genuine hatred. Grimskull visited frequently, sometimes daily, sometimes with several days in between. He never announced his arrival, just appeared in the workshop, dismissed the mech boys with a gesture, and sat down on a crate near Castor's position. The first few visits, he simply sat in silence, as if waiting for the Dreadnought to speak first. When Castor refused to engage, the warlord eventually started talking anyway. "Git, we hit another Humi settlement today," he said during one visit. "Little one, maybe 1,000 of them. They had these big guns on towers, were supposed to keep us out. Didn't work, obviously. We just went around the towers and smashed through from the side." Castor said nothing. Each report of Imperial casualties was like a knife to whatever remained of his hearts. But showing pain would give the Xenos satisfaction, so he remained silent. "Lost 3 of me boys," Grimskull continued, seemingly unbothered by the lack of response. "Not bad for a whole settlement. One of them was this young git, barely bigger than a Gretchen. Was his first real fight. He went down swinging, took 2 Humies with him. That's a proper death, that is." More silence. But Castor's mind was working, analyzing the information despite himself. 3 casualties for an entire settlement. The orcs were being careful, tactical even. That was unusual. Most orc assaults were bloody affairs with terrible casualty rates that the greenskins simply ignored because more orcs would spawn from the battlefield anyway. But Grimskull was minimizing losses while still achieving his objectives. Strategic thinking from an orc warlord. It was almost unheard of. "You's wondering why I keep coming here," Grimskull said, as if reading Castor's thoughts. wondering what an orc war boss wants with a metal Humie that can't even fight back. I can see it in them camera eyes of yours. You's always thinking, always calculating. That's what makes you's interesting. He shifted on his crate, the metal groaning under his weight. Most Humies, they're just targets. They shoot, we shoot back, somebody dies. Oh, and that's the fight. Simple. But you's metal Humies. He's got history. He's got memories of battles I'll never see, enemies I'll never fight. And I'm thinking maybe some of that knowledge could be useful. This time, Castor couldn't remain silent. You want tactical information? Intelligence on Imperial defenses? I would die before betraying the Emperor's Imperium to Xenos scum like you. Grimskull laughed, a booming sound that echoed through the workshop. Nah, nothing like that. I don't care about you's tactics and strategies and all that complicated Humie stuff. I just want to hear about good fights, proper scraps, the kind of battles that make a warrior proud to have been there. The request was so unexpected that Castor actually paused before responding. Why would I share my memories with you? What purpose would that serve? The warlord's expression became serious as an orc could look. Because you's gonna be here for a while. Might as well make the time interesting. Sides, where else are you gonna go? You's brothers think you's dead. You's not gonna escape, not in you's condition. So you's can sit here in silence, slowly going mad in that metal box, or you's can talk to me about fighting. Which sounds better? It was manipulation, obvious and crude. But Castor realized the warlord was right. He was trapped here, possibly for years, possibly until his systems finally failed or the orcs grew bored and tore him apart. And spending that time in total isolation, with nothing but his own thoughts and fading memories, would drive him to madness faster than any torture could. What do you want to know? Castor asked, surprising himself with the resignation in his mechanical voice. Grimskull's grin widened. Everything. Start at the beginning. Tell me about the first time yous were a proper fighter, before you became all metal, when yous were still just a big Humie in armor. And so Castor told him about his recruitment from the hive world Castellus Prime, about the trials that whittled down 1,000 candidates to just 20 survivors, about his first combat operation as a scout, infiltrating an orc camp, not unlike this one, to gather intelligence before the main chapter forces arrived, about the terror he'd felt facing his first greenskin in close combat, about the satisfaction when his combat blade found the Xenos throat, about the pride when his sergeant commended his performance. Grimskull listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions, demanding clarifications about weapons or tactics he didn't understand. And strangest of all, the warlord seemed genuinely interested, not in exploiting the information, not in finding weaknesses to use against the Imperium, but simply in hearing about good fights from a warrior he respected. The conversation lasted hours. When it finally ended, Grimskull stood, stretched his massive arms, and gave Castor something that might have been a salute. That's a proper start, he said. We'll talk more later. I want to hear about when yous became a metal Humie. That must have been some battle to break a fighter like yous. After the warlord left, Castor sat in the darkness of the workshop, processing what had just happened. He'd talked to the enemy, shared memories with a Xenos, engaged in something that felt disturbingly like conversation, like two warriors discussing their craft. The chaplains of his chapter would call it weakness, fraternization with the enemy. The Inquisition would declare him tainted, corrupted by prolonged exposure to Xenos influence. But somehow, for the first time since his capture, Castor felt something other than despair or rage. He felt curiosity. This orc was different from any he'd encountered in 3 centuries of warfare. Grimskull wasn't just a mindless brute, wasn't just a monster to be killed. He was intelligent in his own way, thoughtful even, driven by a code of honor that was alien but not entirely incomprehensible. And if Castor was going to be imprisoned here, possibly for years, possibly forever, then maybe understanding his captor wasn't betrayal. Or maybe it was simple survival. Maybe it was even, in its own strange way, his continued service to the Emperor, gathering intelligence on the enemy from a perspective no other Imperial servant had ever achieved. Or maybe he was just rationalizing, Maybe the isolation was already affecting him, making him see humanity in the inhuman, connection in what should be nothing but the relationship between prisoner and jailer. The thought troubled him as his system cycled down into standby mode, as the orc camp's sounds faded into the background noise of his senses, as something resembling sleep claimed him for the first time since the battle. Whatever the truth was, Castor knew one thing with certainty. His existence had changed. He was no longer a hero of the Imperium, no longer an ancient serving his chapter with honor. Yet he was something else now, something undefined, trapped between the identity he'd spent centuries building and whatever new role this captivity would force him into. The question was whether he could survive that transformation with his sanity intact, and whether survival in this strange new existence was even something worth pursuing, or if death would still be the kinder option. Words across the divide. The repairs continued over the following weeks, Zagrot working with a dedication that seemed almost obsessive for an orc. The big mech had taken Grimskull's order to heart, perhaps recognizing that failure might mean losing his elevated status in the warband. Or maybe, and Castor found this thought disturbing, the mech was genuinely interested in the challenge of repairing such sophisticated technology. Orcs loved building things almost as much as they loved fighting, and this Dreadnought represented the ultimate engineering puzzle. Castor's assault cannon was beyond salvage. Its sacred machine spirits departed, its mechanisms too damaged to repair, even with Zagrot's surprising skills. But the mech didn't give up on giving the Dreadnought firepower. He salvaged a massive orc shooter from some wrecked vehicle, a weapon that fired crude bullets the size of human fists, and somehow managed to mount it where the assault cannon had been. The integration was nightmarish by Imperial standards, all exposed wiring and makeshift brackets, but it held. Might not be as fancy as use Hume gun, Zagrot said, wiping oil from his mechanical eye, but it'll put holes in things proper good. Tested it myself on some scrap metal. Went right through it did. Should work nicely. The power fist required different treatment. Its power cell was drained but not destroyed, so Zagrot focused on recharging it using orc power generators. The first attempt nearly electrocuted the mech when the incompatible systems overloaded. The second attempt started a small fire, but the third attempt, using some component Zagrot refused to explain because you wouldn't understand it anyway. Humitech is too rigid, actually worked. The power field flickered to life, surrounding the massive fist with the distinctive shimmer of a reality-distorting energy weapon. With each repair, Castor became more functional. His sensors sharpened as Zagrot cleaned and recalibrated them. His gyroscopes stabilized as new bearings were installed. Even his Voxcaster improved, and the static and distortion fading until his voice emerged with something approaching its original clarity. Physically, he was being restored, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, he was being transformed into something that disturbed him more with each passing day. Because he kept talking to Grimskull, the warlord visited almost daily now, always alone, except for a Gretchen, who brought fungus beer and roasted squig meat, offerings the orcs seemed to think were appropriate for these conversations. Castor didn't eat, couldn't eat in his entombed state, but Grimskull didn't seem bothered. He'd settle himself on his customary crate, take a long drink of his beer, and ask Castor to continue whatever story they'd been discussing. The tales came easier now. Castor found himself sharing memories he'd thought lost, dredging up details from campaigns centuries past. The defense of Hive Tertius against a Chaos warband, where he'd held a breach in the outer wall for 6 hours straight, while civilians evacuated behind him. The boarding action against a dark Eldar raider, where he and his squad had fought through corridors slick with blood to rescue captured Imperial citizens. The time he'd faced down a Carnifex, the massive Tyrannid bioform, armed with nothing but a combat knife after his bolter had run dry, and somehow survived through a combination of skill and sheer refusal to die. Grimskull absorbed every word, his eyes glowing with enthusiasm when Castor described particularly intense combat. The orc would interrupt with questions. How many shots did it take to bring down the big bug? Or, did the pointy-eared gits fight good? Or, What did it feel like knowing yous might die? He wanted details, wanted to understand not just what happened, but how it felt, how Castor had thought and reacted in the moment. And somehow, impossibly, Grimskull shared his own stories in return. He talked about the world where he'd spawned, a war-torn rock in the Segmentum Obscurus, where 3 different orc clans fought each other constantly. He described his first real fight, going up against a knob twice his size, and winning through cunning rather than strength, proving that a smaller orc could triumph if he fought smart. He reminisced about the battle where he'd earned his warlord status, as defeating the previous boss in single combat while their combined warbands watched, the fight lasting nearly an hour until Grimskull finally crushed his opponent's skull. Felt bad about that one, the warlord admitted during one of these story exchanges. Old Skargrim was a good boss, taught me most of what I know about fighting. But he was slowing down, getting old even for an orc. It was time for new blood. He knew it too. Didn't hold it against me when I made me challenge. Fought his best, went down fighting. That's all any orc can ask for. Castor found himself not sympathizing, that was too strong a word, too disturbing a concept, but understanding. He'd seen Space Marine chapter masters step down when age began to slow their reactions, passing leadership to younger warriors who could better serve the Emperor. Yet the principle was similar, even if the methods were brutally different. Your people have no retirement, Castor observed. No honored service followed by rest. Just constant fighting until something finally kills you. Grimskull laughed. Rest is for humies and other weak gits. Orcs don't need rest. We get bored if we're not fighting. Besides, dying in battle is the point. That's the best death an orc can have. Going out in a proper scrap, taking enemies with you, becoming part of a legend that other boys will tell stories about. What else is there? Peace, Castor said quietly. Knowing that your sacrifices mattered, that the people you protected live because of your actions. Dying with the knowledge that your service was complete. The orc considered this, in his scarred face, thoughtful in a way that should have been impossible for a Xenos. That's a humie thing, innit? This whole greater good business, fighting to protect weaker folk who can't protect themselves. We don't really get that. For orcs, fighting is the point. The winning or losing, the protecting or conquering, that's all secondary. What matters is the fight itself, the thrill of it, the joy of testing yourself against a worthy opponent. And what happens, Castor asked, when you've fought all the worthy opponents, when there's no one left who can challenge you? Grimskull's eyes gleamed with something that might have been fear, or might have been excitement. Then yous become a legend. Maybe yous start a great crusade, gather so many boys that yous can challenge the biggest enemies in the galaxy. Or maybe yous go looking for something that can beat ya. Seek out the toughest fights just to see if yous still got what it takes. That's what the really great war bosses do. They don't stop at conquering one world or one system. They keep fighting until they find something strong enough to put them down. It was nihilistic, this orc philosophy. A culture built entirely around violence for violence's sake, with no higher purpose than the next battle. Everything the Imperium fought against. Everything the Space Marines were created to destroy. And yet, listening to Grimskull describe it, Castor couldn't deny that there was a strange honesty to it. Orcs didn't lie about what they were. They didn't dress up their violence in noble purpose or divine mandate. They just fought because fighting made them happy. And they were remarkably content with that simple truth. Yous humies, though, Grimskull continued. Yous got this whole complicated thing going on. Fighting for the Emperor, fighting for humanity, fighting because some book says you's supposed to. Don't that get exhausting? Always needing a reason, always needing to justify every battle. We need purpose, Castor replied. Without it, we're no better than the chaos forces we fight against. No better than mindless beasts killing for pleasure. Purpose is what separates the righteous from the damned. Or maybe, the warlord said, taking another drink of his beer, maybe yous just can't admit that yous enjoy fighting as much as we do. That deep down, past all the prayers and the duty and the sacrifice, yous like the battle itself. The rush when yous charge into enemy lines. The satisfaction when Yu's weapons tear through armor. The pride when you stand victorious over dead enemies. That's not about the Emperor or humanity or any of that other stuff. That's just the warrior in you, loving what warriors are made to do. The words hit harder than they should have, because there was truth in them, a truth that Castor had never acknowledged in his 300 years of service. He had enjoyed battle, especially in his early years as a space marine, the rush of combat, the challenge of facing deadly enemies, the satisfaction of victory. He'd told himself it was about duty, about serving the Emperor, about protecting humanity, and those things were true. But they weren't the whole truth. Part of him had simply loved the fight, loved being good at something, loved the simplicity of combat, where complicated questions of morality and purpose reduced to a simple binary: win or die. I was a warrior, Castor said finally, raised to fight, trained to kill, engineered to excel at warfare. Of course, I felt satisfaction in doing what I was made to do, but that satisfaction came from serving something greater than myself, not from the violence itself. If you say so, Grimskull replied, but his tone suggested he didn't quite believe it. Me, I don't need to pretend it's about something bigger. I fight because I'm an orc, and orcs fight. Simple as that. And yous know what? I think that's more honest than all yous Humy excuses. They sat in silence for a while after that, Grimskull working through his meal while Castor processed the conversation. These exchanges were becoming dangerous, he realized. Every talk with the warlord chipped away at certainties he'd held for centuries. Every shared story created a connection that shouldn't exist. He was fraternizing with the enemy, finding common ground with a Xenos, questioning the foundations of his service to the Imperium. The chaplains would call it corruption. The Inquisition would declare him tainted. His chapter would disown him if they knew. And yet, trapped in this orc camp with no hope of escape, with nothing but time and a curious warlord for company, what choice did he have? Submit to the conversations or descend into isolation-induced madness? It wasn't really a choice at all. Tell me about when yous became a metal Humy, Grimskull said, breaking the silence. Yous promised yous would, but yous keep avoiding it. What battle broke you so bad that they had to stuff what was left into that box? Castor's optical sensors dimmed slightly, an unconscious gesture that mimicked the closing of eyes he no longer had. The memory was painful, even after 83 years. The memory of his last moments as a full space marine, before everything changed. It was on the shrine world of Benedictus, he began. A chaos warband had corrupted the planetary government, turned them against the Emperor. And he told the story. The desperate defense, the chaos sorcerer who'd called down warp energies, the bolt of pure chaos that had torn through his chest. The moment he'd realized he was dying, the strange peace he'd felt accepting that death. And then, the horrified awakening in the sarcophagus, discovering that death had been denied, was that he would continue to serve in this half-life state for decades or centuries to come. Grimskull listened without interrupting, his expression unusually serious. When Castor finished, the warlord was quiet for a long moment before speaking. That's rough, he said finally. Worse than dying in a fight. At least when you's dead, you's done. But you's stuck in that box, alive but not really living, fighting but not really free. That's cruel, that is. It's considered an honor, Castor said, though his mechanical voice carried a bitterness he couldn't entirely suppress. The greatest heroes are preserved to continue their service. Nah, Grimskull said flatly. That's not honor. That's torture dressed up fancy. You's deserved a warrior's death. Well, they took that from you. It was the closest thing to sympathy Castor had received since his interment. The Tech Marines who'd sealed him in the Dreadnought had been efficient but distant, treating him like sacred machinery that needed proper installation. His battle brothers revered him, but didn't understand him, calling him venerable while avoiding real conversation about what his existence felt like. Only this orc, this savage Xenos who should have been nothing but an enemy, seemed to grasp the tragedy of what had been done to him. "Thank you," Castor said, surprising himself. "That's unexpectedly considerate for a greenskin." Grimskull grinned, his tusks gleaming. "Don't go thinking I'm going soft, Metal Humie. I'd still fight you if you were loose and proper armed. But I can respect a warrior's suffering while also knowing we're enemies. One thing don't cancel out the other." And there it was, Castor realized. The foundation of this impossible connection forming between them. They were enemies, absolutely and irrevocably. The Imperium and the Orcs would always be at war, and nothing would change that fundamental fact. But enemy didn't have to mean monster. It didn't have to mean completely incomprehensible alien. Maybe it just meant someone on the other side who fought for different reasons, but with equal conviction. The thought should have disturbed him more than it did. Instead, as Grimskull finished his meal and prepared to leave, Castor found himself looking forward to their next conversation, to the next story shared. As to the next small connection forged in the space between bolter rounds and the screams of the dying. He was being corrupted, he knew, not by chaos, but by something equally dangerous: understanding. Because once you understood your enemy, once you saw them as more than just targets to eliminate, it became harder to do what was necessary, harder to kill without hesitation, harder to maintain the absolute conviction that the Imperium required of its warriors. But understanding was also survival. In this strange captivity, with years potentially stretching ahead, understanding might be the only thing that kept him sane. So he embraced it, knowing the risk, knowing the cost, but unable to see any better alternative. The war between the Imperium and the Orcs would continue. Millions would die on both sides. And nothing about these conversations changed that. But in this one small corner of that vast conflict, in this workshop on this conquered world, a space marine dreadnought and an Orc warlord were discovering that enemies could still be people, that warriors could respect each other even while committed to each other's destruction. It was a fragile thing, this understanding. Fragile as a ceasefire, temporary as peace always was in the 41st millennium. But for now, it was enough. Life among the greenskins. Weeks turned into months, and Castor's situation evolved in ways he never could have predicted. Zagrot completed the major repairs, pronouncing the Dreadnought proper fixed, even if some of it's held together with Orc ingenuity more than Humie precision. The chains were removed, though Castor suspected this had less to do with trust and more to do with Grimskull's confidence that an isolated Dreadnought surrounded by thousands of Orcs had nowhere to run. The warlord's confidence was justified. Even fully repaired, Castor couldn't fight his way through an entire warband. And even if he somehow escaped the camp, where would he go? The Crimson Castellans had withdrawn from Corvus the 3 months ago, the Imperial forces routed by Grimskull's tactical brilliance. The planet was now firmly in Orc control, its human population either dead, enslaved, or fled to the few remaining Imperial holdouts on the southern continent. Castor was alone, cut off from his chapter, with no hope of rescue. So he adapted. It was that, or go mad, and after 3 centuries of service, Castor wasn't ready to surrender his sanity to despair. Yet he began observing the Orc camp with the same analytical mindset he'd once used to study enemy positions. The camp was sprawling, easily housing 10,000 Orcs plus their Gretchen slaves and various other attendants. It had grown around an old Imperial manufactorum that Grimskull had claimed as his fortress. The original building expanded through typical Orc construction methods that involved welding scrap metal to existing structures and hoping the new additions didn't collapse. The camp's organization was chaotic by Imperial standards, but made a certain brutal sense once you understood the underlying logic. The mech boys controlled the workshops where vehicles were built and repaired. The pain boys ran what passed for medical facilities, though medical was a generous term for spaces where injured Orcs received treatment ranging from sew it back on to cut it off and replace it with a mechanical version. Regular boys lived in crude barracks or simply slept wherever they dropped after a day of fighting or working. And fighting was constant. Not against the remaining Imperial forces, though that happened regularly enough, but amongst themselves. Orcs settled disputes through violence, established social hierarchies through combat, and entertained themselves by brawling whenever boredom set in. The camp echoed with the sounds of fists on flesh, the clang of crude blades, the occasional roar of a shooter when someone decided a disagreement needed to be settled with firepower. But these fights rarely ended in death. Orcs were surprisingly good at pulling their punches when fighting their own kind, some instinct preventing them from killing warband members outside of formal challenges for leadership. A fight would rage for minutes or hours. Blood would be spilled, someone would be knocked unconscious or forced to yield, and then both participants would go back to their business as if nothing had happened. It was violence as social interaction, combat as conversation. Grimskull maintained order through a combination of respect and fear. He was the biggest, strongest orc in the warband, and everyone knew it. When disputes became serious enough to threaten the warband's cohesion, he'd step in and settle the matter personally. Sometimes this meant mediating, surprisingly. The warlord would listen to both sides, make a decision, and enforce it with the implicit threat that anyone who disagreed would face him in personal combat. Other times, when mediation failed, he'd simply crush the heads of everyone involved and declare the matter settled. It was brutal. It was savage. But it worked. Under Grimskull's leadership, the warband functioned with an efficiency that most orc forces never achieved. They didn't waste resources on pointless internal conflicts. They coordinated their attacks on Imperial positions. They even maintained something resembling supply lines, ensuring that ammunition and fuel reached the front lines where they were needed most. It was the kind of organized warfare that would have impressed an Imperial commander if it hadn't been employed by the enemy. Castor found himself with considerable freedom of movement. As Grimskull had made it clear that the metal Humi was under his personal protection, which meant no other orc could touch him without facing the warlord's wrath. This protection extended surprisingly far. Boys who would have torn apart any other Imperial prisoner gave Castor space when he moved through the camp. Knobs who could have easily challenged him nodded in acknowledgement as he passed. Even the Gretchen, usually terrified of everything, seemed merely curious about the walking metal warrior in their midst. He used this freedom to explore, mapping the camp's layout, identifying key facilities, noting the positions of weapon stores and fuel depots. It was intelligence gathering, he told himself. If rescue ever came, if the Crimson Castellans somehow learned he was alive and attempted recovery, this information could be valuable. But part of him knew this was rationalization. The truth was simpler. He explored because it was something to do, a purpose that filled the long hours between Grimskull's visits. The orcs, for their part, seemed genuinely curious about him. Mech boys would approach with questions about Imperial technology, wanting to know how Humi machines worked. Pain boys examined him with professional interest, fascinated by the idea of a Humi kept alive inside a metal shell. Even regular boys would sometimes strike up conversations, asking about battles he'd fought, or how it felt to be a proper metal warrior. These interactions were surreal. Castor found himself explaining the principles of assault cannon operation to Zagrot, who listened with rapt attention and then declared it too complicated. Our orc shooters are better. He described the process of Space Marine creation to a curious pain boy, who responded by offering to improve him with some mechanical upgrades that would probably kill him if his sarcophagus was opened. He even demonstrated his power fist to a group of impressed boys, crushing a boulder to rubble while they cheered and declared him proper killie for a Humi. It was wrong. Every interaction violated decades of training, centuries of ingrained hatred for Xenos. He should have remained silent, refused to engage, maintained the cold distance appropriate for a space marine surrounded by enemies. But isolation and circumstance were powerful forces, and Castor found that he'd rather be wrong than alone. The strangest development came when Grimskull started bringing him to battles. It began almost casually, the warlord mentioning that they were going to raid an Imperial supply convoy and asking if Castor wanted to watch a proper scrap. The offer was absurd. Castor was a prisoner, a captive, not a spectator to be entertained. But the alternative was staying in the camp alone, and curiosity won out over pride. They transported him on a massive orc battle wagon, his Dreadnought chassis chained to the vehicle's flatbed for safety. The ride was terrifying. The orc driver treating concepts like safe speed and avoiding obstacles as suggestions rather than requirements. But they arrived intact at a ridgeline overlooking the Imperial supply route, and Grimskull had him positioned where he could observe the upcoming battle. The raid itself was brutally efficient. The orcs hit the convoy from multiple directions, and overwhelming the guard escorts through sheer numbers and aggressive tactics. Caster watched through his optical sensors as men he'd once fought alongside were cut down by greenskin blades, as vehicles he'd served beside were reduced to burning wrecks. Part of him screamed to intervene, to fight despite his restraints, to die trying to save even a few Imperial soldiers. But he didn't. He couldn't. The chains held him immobile, and even if he'd broken free, what good would one Dreadnought do against thousands of orcs? He'd die pointlessly, achieve nothing, and waste whatever slim chance he had of eventually returning to Imperial service. So he watched, and hated himself for watching, and hated Grimskull for making him watch. After the battle, as the orcs looted the convoy and celebrated their victory, Grimskull approached his position. The warlord was splattered with blood, his power claw dripping with gore, his tusked face split by a satisfied grin. "Good fight, that," he said. "Not great. Humies went down too easy, but good enough. What'd you think?" Caster's response emerged as a mechanical growl. "I think you're a butcher. Those men had families, lives, purposes beyond being targets for your entertainment." "Yeah," Grimskull agreed without shame. "And they knew what they signed up for when they put on them uniforms. Same as yous, same as me. We're all warriors in the end, Metal Humie. Some of us just get to die quick instead of getting stuck in a box." It was infuriating how the warlord could say such things without guilt or hesitation, but it was also, in its way, honest. Yet the Imperial Guard soldiers had known the risks when they took up arms in the Emperor's service. Death in combat was always a possibility, always accepted as the price of defending humanity. That their deaths came at orc hands instead of chaos cultists or tyrannid claws didn't change the fundamental equation. "Why bring me here?" Caster asked. "What purpose does this serve?" Grimskull's expression became thoughtful. "Wanted you to see how we fight. Wanted you to understand that we're not just mindless beasts like yous humies teach. We got tactics, we got skill. We're dangerous because we're smart enough to fight smart when we need to. Also," he paused, as if searching for words, "also wanted company. Fighting's better when someone who understands war is watching. Makes it feel more real, or more important." The admission was unexpectedly vulnerable. This massive warlord, this brutal Xenos who commanded thousands, was lonely. Despite being surrounded by his warband, despite the constant companionship of other orcs, Grimskull wanted someone who could appreciate his martial skill on a level his own species couldn't. He wanted recognition from a worthy opponent, validation that his victories meant something. It was a need Caster understood intimately. How many times had he wished his battle brothers could truly comprehend what he'd sacrificed, what it cost to continue serving in this half-life state? How often had he craved recognition that went beyond formal respect, beyond venerable ancient and ceremonial honors, to real understanding of what he endured? "I see you," Caster said finally. "I see that you're not mindless. I see that you fight with skill and tactics. I see that you're," he struggled with the word, "formidable. As an enemy, you're one of the most dangerous I've encountered." Grimskull's grin widened. "That's all any warrior can ask for, innit? To be seen, to be recognized, to know that you's enemies respect you even while they're trying to kill you." They rode back to the camp in companionable silence, and Caster realized with growing unease that he was no longer entirely sure who was the prisoner and who was the captor. The physical chains might be real, but the emotional bonds forming between them were equally confining. He was being shaped by this captivity, changed in ways that might be irreversible, even if rescue somehow came. But rescue wouldn't come. Months had passed. His chapter believed him dead, and his memory honored in the halls of their fortress monastery. And perhaps that was for the best, because the brother ancient caster they had known, the hero they remembered, had died on that battlefield. What remained was something else, something undefined, trapped between loyalty to an Imperium that had abandoned him and a growing, disturbing connection to a Xenos warlord who seemed determined to show him that enemies could still be people. The war continued around them. Imperial forces fought and died. Orcs conquered and celebrated. And in the space between these opposing forces, a friendship that shouldn't exist continued to grow, fed by shared stories and mutual respect, and the simple human, or perhaps universal, need for connection in the face of endless violence. It was wrong. It was forbidden. It violated every teaching of the Imperium, every principle of the Adeptus Astartes. But it was also real, and getting stronger with each passing day, and Caster no longer had the strength or the desire to fight against it. The bond nobody expected. The turning point came during a battle Caster would never forget, though he wished he could. Grimskull's warband was attacking an Imperial fortification, one of the last major strongholds on Corvus III's northern continent. The fortress was well defended, its walls thick enough to withstand artillery, its guns capable of tearing through Orc vehicles with ease. The Imperial forces had learned from their previous defeats, adapting their tactics to counter Grimskull's strategies. This wouldn't be an easy victory. Caster watched from his usual position on the battle wagon, chained and helpless, and as the Orcs assembled for the assault. Thousands of them, organized into mobs by nobs, who actually seemed to care about formation and coordination. The big mechs had built siege engines, crude but effective battering rams and siege towers that would allow the boys to reach the fortress walls. This was a proper siege, not just a mindless charge, and Caster couldn't help but feel a professional respect for the planning involved. But respect turned to horror when the assault began. The Imperial defenders were ready. They'd learned that Grimskull preferred flanking attacks and prepared accordingly, covering all approaches with overlapping fields of fire. When the Orcs charged, they ran into a wall of lass fire and heavy bolter rounds that cut down entire mobs before they'd covered half the distance. Artillery rained down on the siege engines, smashing them to splinters. Rockets fired from Orc lines exploded harmlessly against void shields the Imperials had somehow managed to activate. It was a slaughter. The Orcs kept coming because that's what Orcs did, throwing themselves into the meat grinder with reckless courage. But courage wasn't enough against prepared defenses and superior firepower. Caster watched hundreds of greenskins die in the first wave, watched their crude tactics fail against Imperial discipline, and felt nothing but grim satisfaction. This was how it should be. The Emperor's forces prevailing against Xenos scum, order defeating chaos. Then he saw Grimskull enter the battle personally. The warlord charged through the killing field like a force of nature, his mega armor shrugging off hits that would have destroyed lesser warriors, yet his power claw tearing through void shields as if they were paper. Boys rallied around him, inspired by their boss's courage, pushing forward despite the casualties. And for a moment, just a moment, Caster thought the mad bastard might actually win. The Lascannon hit Grimskull from the side, a shot from a hidden emplacement the Orcs hadn't detected. The beam punched through his armor, melting ceramite and the Orc flesh beneath, sending the massive warlord crashing to the ground. His boys faltered, seeing their boss fall, their advance stalling as confusion spread through the ranks. The Imperial defenders pressed their advantage, concentrating fire on the leaderless Orcs, driving them back from the walls. Caster's reaction surprised him. Instead of satisfaction at seeing the enemy leader fall, he felt something closer to alarm. Maybe even concern. This Orc, this Xenos who'd kept him prisoner for months, who'd shared stories and meals and something approximating friendship, was dying out there. And with Grimskull's death would likely come Caster's own, as the warband fell apart without its leader and some new boss emerged, who wouldn't have any interest in keeping a pet dreadnought around. But that wasn't the reason his systems suddenly surged to full combat readiness. That wasn't why he strained against his chains with enough force to make the metal groan. The reason was simpler and more disturbing. He didn't want Grimskull to die. Not for strategic reasons, not for self-preservation, but because over these months of captivity, the warlord had become not a friend exactly. That word was still too dangerous to accept. But an ally, a companion, is someone whose presence had made this imprisonment bearable. The chains snapped. Castor didn't know his own strength until that moment, didn't realize that months of repairs and orc modifications had made him even more powerful than before. The battle wagon lurched as 13 tons of Dreadnought freed itself, and then Castor was moving, stomping across the battlefield toward Grimskull's fallen form. "Metal Humi!" An orc nob tried to intercept him, confused by the Dreadnought's sudden freedom. Castor's power fist crushed the Xenos without slowing, his mechanical legs carrying him forward with surprising speed. His orc-built shooter roared, cutting down a group of boys who'd positioned themselves between him and the warlord. He was fighting orcs, killing greenskins to reach another greenskin. As the insanity of it registered somewhere in his consciousness, but he pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about loyalty or betrayal. This was about what? What was this about? He couldn't articulate it, couldn't justify it, but his actions continued regardless. Grimskull was still alive when Castor reached him, his massive chest heaving with labored breaths, green blood pooling beneath his body. The warlord's eyes focused on the Dreadnought with what might have been surprise or might have been satisfaction. "Come to finish the job, Metal Humi," he gasped. "Can't say. I blame you." "No," Castor heard himself say. "I came to get you out of here. Can you stand?" Grimskull laughed, a wet, painful sound. "Why? Why help? An orc? Use enemy?" "Because I'm an idiot," Castor replied. And because you're too interesting to let die to Imperial gunfire. Now move, before I change my mind." He grabbed Grimskull with his power fist. The field deactivated to avoid further injury and began dragging the massive orc back toward orc lines. Last fire stitched across his armor, Imperial gunners targeting the Dreadnought now that he'd revealed himself as hostile. Bolt rounds exploded against his chassis, blackening ceramite, but not penetrating. A missile streaked toward them, but Castor intercepted it with his shooter, detonating it in mid-air. The orcs rallied when they saw their boss being rescued. They charged forward to provide covering fire, their weapons blazing with renewed enthusiasm. Several knobs formed a protective circle around Castor and Grimskull, taking hits meant for their fallen leader, as a painboy appeared from somewhere, already preparing his crude medical tools. They made it back to orc lines, barely. Castor set Grimskull down as gently as he could with a power fist, then turned to face the fortress. The Imperial defenders were still firing, still trying to kill him, and he should have felt nothing but righteous fury at the greenskin horde around him. Instead, he felt oddly calm. He'd made his choice, for better or worse, and there was no going back now. The painboy worked on Grimskull with surprising skill, his various medical implements sewing flesh and replacing damaged organs with mechanical alternatives. Orc medicine was brutal but effective, relying on the greenskin's incredible regenerative abilities and complete disregard for concepts like anesthesia or sterile procedures. But it worked. And within minutes, Grimskull was sitting up, his chest covered in crude stitching and mechanical augmentations. The warlord looked at Castor for a long moment, his red eyes unreadable. Then he laughed, a booming sound that carried across the battlefield. "Yous mad bastard! Yous actually saved me! A Metal Humi saved an orc boss! That's the craziest thing I've ever heard!" "Yes," Castor agreed quietly. "Yes, it is." The assault on the fortress was called off, the warband falling back to regroup and allow Grimskull to recover. As they rode back to camp, the warlord kept looking at Castor as if seeing him for the first time. And perhaps he was. because what Castor had done changed everything. It wasn't just a space marine interacting with orcs anymore. It was a space marine actively helping orcs. Fighting against Imperial forces to protect a Xenos. There were names for such things: traitor, heretic, corrupted. But Castor felt none of those labels fit. He hadn't betrayed the Emperor's ideals. He'd saved a life because it deserved saving, regardless of what species that life belonged to. He'd acted with mercy toward an enemy who'd shown him mercy first. He'd done what his conscience demanded even when it violated every rule of his training. Whether that made him heroic or damned, he couldn't say. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps such labels were meaningless in the face of individual choice and consequence. Back at camp, after the Pain Boys had finished their work, and Grimskull was resting in his quarters, the warlord summoned Castor. The Dreadnought came unescorted, the chains no longer necessary, and both of them understanding that he wouldn't run even if he could. "I owe you," Grimskull said simply. "That's not a thing orcs usually say, but it's true. You saved my life when you could have let me die. When you probably should have let me die, from you's perspective, so I owe you a debt." "I don't want payment," Castor replied. "I did what I thought was right in the moment, that's all." "Nah," the warlord shook his massive head. "That's not how this works. A debt is a debt, and I always pay me debts. So here's what I'm offering. Use freedom. I'll have me mech boys fix you up with enough fuel and supplies to reach the southern continent where you's humies still hold territory. You can go back to you's chapter. Tell 'em whatever story you want about how you survived. I won't stop you." The offer hung in the air between them. Freedom. El returned to the Imperium, resume his identity as a Crimson Castellan, as a hero of the Emperor. Everything he'd wanted since his capture, offered freely, without condition. And Castor realized he didn't want it. Not anymore. Not like this. "I can't go back," he said slowly, working through the thought even as he spoke it. "What would I tell them? That I was captured by orcs and spent months as their prisoner, but they just let me go out of kindness. They'd never believe it. They'd assume corruption, taint, heresy. I'd face interrogation, mind scrubbing, possibly execution. And even if I survived all that, I could never explain. This," he gestured between himself and Grimskull, "this understanding we've developed. This, whatever this is." "Friendship," Grimskull said bluntly. "That's the word you's looking for. We're friends, Metal Humie." "Oh, ain't supposed to happen, but it did. An orc and a space marine actually liking each other enough to risk our lives for the other. That's mad, that is. Completely proper mad." Friends. The word felt forbidden, dangerous, like a curse that would damn his soul if he acknowledged it. But it was also accurate. They were friends. Impossible as it seemed, they'd formed a genuine connection across the gulf of species and ideology that should have made such a thing impossible. "So, what happens now?" Castor asked. "I can't return to the Imperium. You've given me freedom but nowhere to use it. Where does that leave us?" Grimskull's tusked grin returned. "Leaves us exactly where we are. You stay with the warband, but not as a prisoner. As a... advisor. Yeah, that works. You help me understand how humies think. Give me insights into Imperial tactics. Make me a better war boss. And in return you get to stay alive, stay active, keep fighting, even if it's not for you's chapter anymore." "You're asking me to fight against the Imperium," Castor said flatly. "To actively work against my own species." "Nah," the warlord corrected. "I'm asking you to survive. The Imperium don't want you back, not really. They'd sooner scrub you's brain than believe you weren't corrupted. So you's options are, go back and face certain death, wander off alone and slowly go mad, or stay here, where at least you's got someone to talk to. Not much of a choice, really." He was right, and they both knew it. Castor's options had narrowed to this single path, and resisting it would be pointless. Better to embrace his new reality, strange as it was, than to cling to a past that no longer existed. The brother ancient caster of the Crimson Castellans had died months ago. What remained was something new, something undefined, something that needed to find its purpose, in this unexpected situation. "I won't help you slaughter Imperial citizens," Castor said firmly. "I won't provide intelligence that leads to unnecessary bloodshed. I won't betray the Emperor's subjects, even if I can't serve him directly anymore." "Fair enough," Grimskull agreed readily. "I ain't asking you to be a traitor, just to be honest about what works and what don't from a military perspective. And maybe to keep me company, since apparently I'm the only orc in the galaxy who thinks conversations are as interesting as fighting." It was a compromise, a middle ground between loyalty and betrayal. Castor would help the orcs become more efficient warriors, but he wouldn't actively target Imperial forces. He'd share his knowledge of warfare in general terms, without providing specific intelligence. He'd be an advisor without being a traitor, a teacher without being a turncoat. It was a fine line to walk, probably impossible to maintain forever, but it was the best option available. "All right," Castor said finally. "I'll stay, but on my terms. I speak honestly, even when the truth isn't convenient. I advise according to my conscience, not your objectives, and I maintain the right to refuse if you ask me to do something I find unconscionable." Grimskull extended his power claw, the massive metal hand held out in what was unmistakably a gesture of agreement. "Deal. Now shake on it, Metal Humie. Let's make this official." Castor stared at the offered hand, at this Xenos warrior who'd captured him, kept him alive, listened to his stories, and now offered him purpose when he had none. Then, he extended his own power fist, the two mechanical hands clasping together in an agreement that both of them knew would change them forever. The friendship between an orc and a dreadnought was sealed in that moment. Impossible, forbidden, real. And in the grim darkness of the far future, sometimes the most important alliances were the ones that never should have existed. Defending together. The months that followed were among the strangest and most contradictory of Castor's long existence. By day, he served as Grimskull's military advisor, or sitting in on war councils where knobs argued over tactics and big mechs proposed increasingly insane weapon designs. He offered perspective on Imperial defensive doctrine, explained why certain approaches would fail against Space Marine tactics, suggested alternatives that played to orc strengths while avoiding predictable Imperial counters. It was a careful balance. He never provided specific intelligence on Imperial positions or unit strengths. He never suggested attacks on civilian populations or targets that served no military purpose. But he did help the orcs fight more efficiently, reduce their own casualties, achieve their objectives with less waste. He told himself this was acceptable because it saved lives on both sides, reducing the meat grinder battles where thousands died for minimal gain. Whether that rationalization would stand up to inquisitorial scrutiny was a question he tried not to think about too deeply. By night, or rather during the hours when Grimskull wasn't leading raids or attending to war boss business, they continued their conversations. They'd fallen into a routine. Castor would position himself in a quiet corner of the camp, away from the constant noise of boys fighting and vehicles being repaired, and Grimskull would join him with his customary meal of roasted squig and fungus beer. They'd talk for hours, sharing stories, debating philosophy, arguing over tactical decisions, sometimes simply sitting in companionable silence. "Tell me about you's homeworld," Grimskull said during one of these sessions. "You mentioned it once but never talked about it proper. What was it like before the Imperium took you?" Castor's optical sensors dimmed slightly, dredging up memories from so long ago they felt like they'd happened to someone else. Castellus Prime. A hive world. 40 billion citizens packed into metal spires that reached into the clouds. I was born in the lower levels, where sunlight never reached and the air tasted of recycled chemicals. My parents worked in the manufactorums, 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, producing bolter rounds for the Astra Militarum. I had 3 siblings. 2 died before they reached 10 years old, diseases that were easily curable in the upper hives, but fatal in the lower levels, where medical care was considered a luxury. "Sounds grim," Grimskull observed, "even for humies." "It was life," Castor said simply. "We didn't know anything else." The Crimson Castellans recruited from the lower hives, testing children for potential. I was 12 when they came. They put us through trials that killed most candidates, physical and mental tests that separated the strong from the weak. I survived. My remaining siblings didn't. And you never went back? The warlord asked. Never saw you's parents again? Space Marines don't go back, Castor explained. Once you're accepted into a chapter, your old life ends. Your family receives compensation, a pension that lifts them out of the lower hives if they use it wisely. But you yourself never return. You're no longer their child. You're a son of the Emperor, a warrior in his eternal crusade. Personal attachments are weakness, connections to the past that could compromise your devotion to duty. Grimskull snorted. That's cold, that is. Orcs don't have families the way yous do, but we remember where we came from, the spawning ground that birthed us, the first boss who taught us to fight, the warband that raised us up. Those connections matter. They're also vulnerabilities, Castor countered. Enemies can exploit family ties, use them to manipulate or blackmail you. By severing those connections, the Imperium ensures its warriors are loyal only to humanity as a whole, not to individuals who might have conflicting interests. Or, the warlord said thoughtfully, it ensures you's completely alone, with nobody to care about except the Imperium itself. Makes it easier to throw yous into meat grinders, knowing you got nobody who'll mourn you personally. The observation hit harder than Castor wanted to admit, because Grimskull was right in his crude way. As the Imperium's strength came partly from treating its warriors as expendable resources, rather than individuals with lives and connections worth preserving. It made for an efficient military machine, but at the cost of the humanity it claimed to protect. What about you? Castor asked, deflecting. What was your spawning ground like? Grimskull's eyes took on a distant look, remembering. It was on a world called Greca. Hot place, lots of volcanic activity, poisonous air. Proper tough environment, which meant only the strongest orcs survived. I pulled myself out of the fungus already bigger than most boys, which meant I started with an advantage. First thing I remember is another young orc trying to establish dominance. I broke his jaw. Set the tone for the rest of my life, really. No guidance? Castor asked. No training from older orcs? Nah, we figure things out as we go. The knowledge is just there in us heads, like instinct but more detailed. We know how to fight from the moment we can stand, know what weapons are, know the structure of orc society. The older boys might beat some lessons into you, but mostly you learn by doing. You fight, you win or lose, you grow stronger from the experience. Simple. Simple, Castor echoed. That word seems to define orc philosophy. Keep everything simple, direct, uncomplicated by doubt or second-guessing. Exactly, Grimskull agreed enthusiastically. Use humies. Use always overthinking things. What's the moral implications? What about the greater strategic picture? How does this serve the Emperor's plan? Just fight the enemy in front of you and worry about the rest later. Or life's too short to spend it philosophizing when you could be having a proper scrap. They debated this point, as they'd debated many points over their months of friendship. Castor argued for the necessity of strategic thinking, of considering long-term consequences, of fighting for a purpose beyond the immediate joy of combat. Grimskull countered that overthinking led to paralysis, that the best fighters trusted their instincts. That purpose was something you found in the moment rather than imposed from outside. Neither convinced the other, but that wasn't the point. The point was the conversation itself, the meeting of minds across impossible divides, the discovery that even the most alien intelligence could be understood if you invested the effort to listen. The real test of their friendship came during a raid on an Imperial convoy. Our Grimskull had asked Castor to accompany him, not as a prisoner this time, but as an active participant. The Dreadnought had refused initially, unwilling to actively fight against Imperial forces. But the warlord had pressed, arguing that Castor's presence would actually reduce casualties on both sides by preventing the kind of reckless charges that got both orcs and guardsmen killed unnecessarily. You don't have to shoot Humies, Grimskull had said. Just be there as a voice of reason. Keep me from doing anything too stupid in the heat of battle. That's all I'm asking. Against his better judgment, Castor agreed, and found himself on a battlefield once more, his weapons loaded, his sensors tracking targets, his every system screaming at him to engage enemy forces and defend the Imperium. But he held his fire, focused instead on tactical coordination. When Grimskull prepared to order a frontal assault that would have cost dozens of Orc lives, Castor suggested a flanking maneuver that achieved the same objective with minimal casualties. When Imperial forces prepared to counterattack into an obvious trap, he convinced Grimskull to pull his boys back slightly, allowing the guardsmen to retreat without suffering unnecessary losses. The raid succeeded. The convoy was captured, its supplies seized for the Orc war effort. But the casualty rate on both sides was remarkably low, by 40,000 standards. Dozens dead instead of hundreds, wounded instead of annihilated. It wasn't mercy exactly, but it was warfare conducted with something approaching restraint, guided by principles that prioritized efficiency over bloodshed. "Ya did good," Grimskull said afterward, as they surveyed the battlefield. "Kept me from getting too enthusiastic, saved a bunch of boys who would have died otherwise, even saved some Humies, though they probably don't appreciate it." "I helped you attack Imperial forces," Castor said quietly. "Helped you steal supplies that were meant to defend against Xenos invasions. That's betrayal. That's treason. I'm everything the Imperium warned Space Marines not to become." "Or," the warlord countered, "you've prevented a slaughter, made sure the fight stayed military instead of turning into a massacre. That's got to count for something, right?" Did it? Castor didn't know. The moral calculus was too complex, too tangled in contradictions to pass cleanly. He'd betrayed his oaths by helping Orcs, but he'd saved lives by making that help conditional on restraint. He'd worked against the Imperium, but he'd prevented atrocities that would have happened without his intervention. Perhaps good and evil weren't simple binaries in a universe this complicated. Perhaps there were only choices and consequences, actions and reactions, individuals trying to do what they thought was right in impossible situations. Perhaps judgment belonged to the Emperor or the historians or whoever sorted through the wreckage after everyone involved was dead. The final battle. The end came, as endings always do, with fire and blood. The Imperium finally assembled enough forces to counterattack Farthest III in strength. 3 full regiments of Imperial Guard, a company of Crimson Castellans, Sisters of Battle from the Order of the Sacred Rose, and even a detachment of Scutari from the Adeptus Mechanicus. It was a crusade in everything but name, designed to purge the Orc infestation once and for all. Grimskull's scouts brought word of the approaching armada weeks before it arrived. The warlord called a war council, gathering every knob and big mech in the warband to plan their response. Castor attended as he always did now, no longer a prisoner, but an acknowledged advisor, his tactical expertise valued even by Orcs, who should have seen him as nothing but an enemy. "We can't win a straight fight," Grimskull declared, his power claw pounding on the crude map table. "They got too many forces, too much firepower. If we try to meet 'em head-on, we'll be wiped out." The Nobs grumbled at this admission, at their orcish instincts demanding they charge the enemy and fight until the last boy stood. But they'd learned over months of campaigning that their boss's tactical caution kept them alive longer, gave them more opportunities for proper fights. So they listened as Grimskull outlined his plan. "We hit 'em where they're weak," he continued. "Strike their supply lines, disrupt their coordination, make 'em split their forces to cover multiple threats. Classic guerrilla warfare. Keep 'em off balance until an opportunity presents itself." It was sound strategy, the kind of approach Castor himself might have suggested. But as he listened to the details, he realized with growing dread that success would mean prolonging the war, ensuring more Imperial casualties, delaying the eventual liberation of Farthest III. And everything he'd worked to prevent would happen anyway, just spread out over months instead of concentrated into a single decisive battle. After the council dispersed, Castor requested a private meeting with Grimskull. The warlord agreed readily, leading him to a quiet section of the camp where they could talk without interruption. "This is wrong," Castor said without preamble. "You know you can't win. The Imperium has committed too many resources to this world. Eventually they'll grind you down, kill every orc on the planet, sterilize the soil to prevent spores from regrowing. All you're doing is delaying the inevitable while ensuring more people die on both sides." Grimskull's expression was unusually serious. "Probably right about that. But what's the alternative? Surrender? Orcs don't do surrender, Metal Humi. But we fight until we win, or we're dead. That's who we are." "You could evacuate," Castor suggested. "Load your forces onto whatever ships you still have, leave this world, find somewhere else to fight. Survival is better than pointless death." "For Humies, maybe," the warlord said. "But for orcs, a proper death in battle is the whole point. Going out in a fight so intense that stories about it get told for generations, that's what we all hope for. Running away to live another day ain't the orc way." They argued for hours, Castor trying to convince Grimskull to see reason, the warlord remaining immovable in his conviction that fighting to the death was preferable to retreat. And gradually, Castor realized the fundamental difference between them that no amount of friendship could bridge. Grimskull truly didn't fear death. Didn't see it as something to avoid. For him, dying in battle was the ultimate achievement, the validation of a life spent pursuing combat. "I can't change what I am," Grimskull said finally. "Any more than yous can. We're both warriors, both shaped by our cultures and our genetics to serve roles we didn't choose. The difference is, I've made peace with it. Have yous?" The question hung in the air between them. Had Castor made peace with being a dreadnought, with this half-life of endless battle and fading humanity? Or was he still fighting against his own nature, raging against the prison of his existence, refusing to accept what he'd become? "No," he admitted, "I haven't. Every day I wake up in this metal shell, I'm reminded of what I lost. The ability to touch with hands instead of weapons, the chance to die with dignity instead of being preserved past the point where life has meaning, the freedom to be something other than a walking war machine." "Then maybe," Grimskull said gently, "maybe this is you's chance, this final battle, when it comes. Maybe it's you's opportunity to finally find the peace you's been looking for, to go out on you's own terms, fighting for something you believe in, instead of just surviving because that's what you's programmed to do." The suggestion was unexpected, but as Castor considered it, he realized the warlord might be right. He'd been living in a state of suspended animation for decades, not fully alive but not permitted to die. This battle, this final confrontation between the Imperium and Grimskull's warband, could be his chance to break that cycle. To make a choice about his own ending, instead of having it determined by chapter protocol and Techmarine maintenance schedules. "What are you proposing?" Castor asked. Grimskull's tusked grin returned. "I'm proposing we make this last fight count. Not just another skirmish or raid, but something proper big. Something that shows both our peoples what we're capable of when we fight at our best. And when it's over, when the dust settles and the bodies are counted, at least we'll know we went down swinging." It was madness, suicidal, pointless madness. But it was also, in its way, freedom. The chance to choose his own death, to fight one last battle not because he was ordered to, but because he wanted to die as a warrior instead of slowly deteriorating into a mindless weapon. It was what he'd been denied when they interred him in this dreadnought chassis, the right to decide when enough was enough. "I'm with you," Castor said. "One last battle. Let's make it legendary." They clasped hands, power fist and power claw, a gesture that had become comfortable over months of friendship, and began planning their final stand. The ending nobody expected. The Imperial forces arrived 3 weeks later, their ships filling the sky with drop pods and landing craft. The Crimson Castellans deployed to the northern continent, their blue and silver armor gleaming in the weak sunlight, determined to finish what they'd started months ago. Castor watched from the walls of Grimskull's fortress, his optical sensors tracking his former brothers as they established their position. Part of him wanted to reach out, to try to make contact, to explain what had happened to him. But he knew they wouldn't understand. Couldn't understand. The chaplains would declare him corrupted, the librarians would probe his mind for taint, and the best he could hope for would be a quick death instead of the slow agony of interrogation and eventual execution. Better to remain anonymous, just another dreadnought fighting in the chaos of war, unrecognized until it was too late. The battle began at dawn, 3 days later. The Imperial Guard advanced first, thousands of soldiers in ordered ranks, supported by artillery and armor. They came across the valley floor in textbook formation, a wall of flesh and steel that should have been unstoppable. Behind them, the Space Marines waited, ready to exploit any breakthrough, to turn tactical advantage into strategic victory. Grimskull's warband met them with everything they had. Orc artillery answered Imperial guns, shells arcing through the sky to explode among the advancing troops. Death Dreads and Killer Khans charged from concealed positions, their crude weapons blazing. Boys surged from trenches and fortifications, howling their battle cries, rushing forward to meet the enemy with chopper and slugger. And in the center of the Orc line, fighting side by side, stood a warlord and a dreadnought. Grimskull's power claw carved through Imperial armor, while Castor's weapons spoke with deadly precision, each shot finding a target, each movement calculated for maximum efficiency. They fought as they'd never fought before, two warriors who understood each other perfectly, who could anticipate each other's moves, who covered each other's weaknesses through months of shared experience. The Imperial forces faltered before this unexpected coordination. They'd been prepared for typical Orc tactics, reckless charges and overwhelming numbers. But this was different. This was intelligent warfare, conducted by enemies who thought and adapted, who used tactics that would have impressed an Imperial commander. The guard lines bent, then broke, soldiers falling back in confusion as the Orc assault pushed forward with unexpected discipline. That's when the Space Marines intervened. They dropped from the sky on pillars of fire, jump packs roaring, bolters blazing. The Crimson Castellans hit the Orc forces from multiple angles, their superhuman warriors cutting through greenskins like chainsaws through flesh. And leading them was a dreadnought. It's a Castroferrum pattern. Mark V that Castor recognized even before he saw the nameplate. Brother Ancient Marcus, his predecessor in the chassis he now piloted. The warrior who'd taught Castor his first lessons in the scout company, who'd mentored him through his early campaigns, who'd been interred decades before Castor suffered his own fatal wounds. Marcus had been the reason Castor chose to accept internment instead of death, believing that if his mentor could find purpose in that existence, so could he. Now they faced each other across a battlefield, two dreadnoughts who'd once fought side by side, separated by choices and circumstances neither had anticipated. Brother Castor? Marcus's voice crackled through the Vox channels. Is that truly you? We thought you dead. Your sarcophagus destroyed in the battle months ago. I survived, Castor replied simply. And I've seen things that changed my understanding of who our enemies are. You fight alongside Xenos. Marcus's mechanical voice carried shock and anger. You stand with Orcs against your own chapter. Brother, what madness has gripped you? How could he explain months of conversations and shared stories? How could he convey the friendship that had formed in captivity, the understanding that had grown despite every barrier of species and ideology? Words failed, so Castor did the only thing he could. He stood his ground, his weapons trained on his former mentor, and prepared to fight. I'm sorry, Ancient Marcus, he said. I know you can't understand, but I can't fight beside you anymore. Not after everything I've learned. Or not after realizing that enemies can be people, that monsters can have honor, that the universe is more complex than our doctrines admit. Then you are truly lost, Marcus said sadly. May the Emperor have mercy on your soul, brother. They charged each other, two walking tanks meeting with earth-shaking impact. Power fist against power fist, weapons blazing at point-blank range, centuries of combat experience deployed against each other. Around them the battle raged, Orcs fighting Space Marines, Imperial Guard clashing with greenskin boys, But the two dreadnoughts were locked in their own private war. Castor fought with everything he'd learned in 3 centuries of combat, plus the tactical innovations he'd absorbed from working with Grimskull. He was faster, more aggressive than Marcus expected, at using Orc-style tactics that his former mentor couldn't predict. But Marcus was fresh, his systems fully maintained by skilled tech marines, his ammunition stores full, his armor undamaged. The fight was even, 2 veterans perfectly matched, neither able to gain decisive advantage. Then Grimskull entered the fray. The warlord crashed into Marcus from the side, his power claw seeking gaps in the dreadnought's armor, his massive strength allowing him to grapple the war machine. Marcus turned to face this new threat, his assault cannon pivoting to track the Orc boss. "No!" Castor shouted, but too late. Marcus's cannon roared, mass reactive shells tearing into Grimskull at point-blank range, the impacts throwing the warlord back. Green blood sprayed across Ceramite, and the Orc boss went down. Rage, pure and hot, flooded through Castor's consciousness. Rage at seeing his friend wounded, possibly killed. Rage at the Imperium that had created this situation, that had given him no choices but this impossible one. Rage at himself for allowing emotions he should have purged decades ago to control his actions. His power fist struck Marcus with every ounce of his dreadnought's strength. The reality-distorting field around his mechanical hand tore through armor that should have been impenetrable, crushed servos and support systems, damaged the gyroscopes that kept a dreadnought upright. Marcus stumbled, tried to recover, but Castor didn't give him the chance. He struck again, and again, each blow driven by grief and fury, and the desperate need to protect the one being in the galaxy who'd treated him as a person instead of a weapon. Marcus fell. His armor split open, revealing the sarcophagus beneath, and for one terrible moment, Castor saw his mentor's face, preserved in nutrient fluid, eyes wide with shock and betrayal. Then the sarcophagus failed, life support systems dying, and brother ancient Marcus of the Crimson Castellans passed into the Emperor's care. "No," Castor whispered, the word lost in the din of battle. "No, I didn't mean. I just wanted." "You did what you had to," Grimskull's voice rasped. The warlord was pulling himself upright, bleeding from a dozen wounds, half his armor shredded by bolter fire, but alive. Impossibly, stubbornly alive. That's all any warrior can do. Make the choice in the moment, and live with it after. The battle around them was turning. The Imperial forces, seeing a dreadnought fall to Orc weapons, redoubled their efforts. The Space Marines pressed forward with renewed fury, determined to avenge their fallen brother. The Orc forces, despite their courage and improved tactics, were being pushed back by superhuman warriors, backed by endless guard reinforcements. "Time to go," Grimskull said, understanding the tactical situation even through his pain. "We've made our stand, fought our fight, no shame in living to fight another day." "You said Orcs don't retreat," Castor replied. "Orcs don't surrender," the warlord corrected. "Retreating to fight better battles is just smart tactics. And right now, smart tactics says we get out while we still can." Castor looked at the fallen form of brother ancient Marcus, his mentor, his teacher, the warrior he'd just killed to protect an Orc. The magnitude of what he'd done crashed over him. But there was no time to process it, no space to grieve. Survival demanded movement, demanded escape, demanded living with consequences he couldn't yet comprehend. "All right," he said. "Let's go." They fought their way out together, Castor covering Grimskull's retreat, the warlord directing his boys to create openings they could exploit. It wasn't a rout, wasn't a panicked flight. It was a tactical withdrawal, conducted with the skill of experienced warriors who'd learned to trust each other completely. They left the fortress behind, abandoned the northern continent, and fled to the southern jungles where Orc spores had already taken root, ensuring that even if this warband was destroyed, more Orcs would rise to take their place. Behind them, the Crimson Castellans claimed victory. They recovered brother ancient Marcus's body. He prepared his sarcophagus for transport back to the chapter's homeworld, and declared the northern continent purged. But they didn't pursue into the southern jungles, didn't risk their forces in that hostile environment. The war on Corvus III would continue, they knew, perhaps for years. But this battle was over, and in those jungles, as Pain Boys worked to repair Grimskull's wounds and Zagrot examined the damage to Castor's systems, the Dreadnought and the Warlord sat together in silence. There were no words adequate to the moment, no way to articulate what they'd experienced, what they'd lost, what they'd become. "I killed him," Castor said finally. "My mentor, my teacher. I killed a hero of the Imperium to save a Xenos warlord. That's who I am now. That's what I've become." "No," Grimskull said firmly. "You saved a friend. Yes, that's who yous are. Someone who values individuals over ideology, who chooses people over principles. The Imperium would call that weakness. I call it strength." "The Imperium would call it treason," Castor corrected. "And they wouldn't be wrong." They sat in silence for longer, listening to the sounds of the jungle, the calls of alien creatures and the distant thunder of continuing warfare. Eventually Grimskull spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "You know what the difference between us is, Metal Humie. I was born for war. It's all I've ever known, all I've ever wanted. But yous were made for it, transformed into a weapon by people who didn't ask if that's what you wanted. And yet you still managed to find something beyond the fighting, still built connections and friendships, even when your whole society taught you not to. Well, that's pretty remarkable, that is." "Or it's corruption," Castor said. "The taint of prolonged exposure to Xenos. Maybe the Imperium was right to be paranoid. Maybe allowing connection with the enemy is the first step toward betraying everything you stand for. Or maybe," the Warlord suggested, "maybe betraying everything you stand for is the only way to discover what you actually believe. Strip away the programming and the indoctrination and the centuries of conditioning, and what's left? What does Brother Castor believe deep down where nobody can tell him what to think?" It was the question Castor had been avoiding for months. What did he believe? Not what the Imperium taught, not what his chapter demanded, not what 3 centuries of service had conditioned into him, but what the individual consciousness trapped inside this metal shell, actually thought was true and right and worth fighting for. "I believe," he said slowly, working it out as he spoke, "that individuals matter more than institutions, that mercy is strength, not weakness, that enemies can become friends if both parties are willing to look past the surface and see the person underneath. And I believe that purpose isn't given by authority or doctrine or genetic programming. It's something you choose for yourself, even when that choice costs everything." Grimskull's tusked grin was visible even in the jungle's gloom. "There you go. That's truth, that is. Use own truth, earned through experience, not handed down from some distant emperor who probably never had a real conversation in his life. Well, that's worth more than 1,000 holy books." They sat together until dawn, 2 warriors who should have been enemies but had become friends, bound by shared experiences and mutual respect, and the simple fact that they'd chosen each other over the ideologies that defined them. The war would continue. The Imperium would hunt them. The Orcs would fight on. But in this moment, in this place, there was peace. And sometimes, in the grim darkness of the far future, peace was the rarest and most valuable thing of all. Conclusion. If you've made it this far in our journey through the strangest friendship in the 41st millennium, thank you. Thank you for listening to a story about connection in a universe designed to make connection impossible. About understanding in a galaxy that thrives on misunderstanding. About individuals who chose each other over the weight of civilizations that taught them such choices were impossible. The tale of Brother Ancient Castor and Warlord Grimskull reminds us that even in the darkest settings, even in universes built on endless war and uncompromising hatred, people can still find common ground. They can still build bridges across seemingly impassable divides. They can still choose friendship over fear, understanding over ideology, individuals over institutions. Whether this makes them heroes or traitors depends entirely on your perspective. The Imperium would see Castor as corrupted, a cautionary tale about the dangers of showing mercy to Xenos. The Orcs might view Grimskull as too soft, too willing to spare enemies who should have been crushed. But from their own perspectives, from the space they inhabited between opposing forces, perhaps they were simply two beings trying to maintain their humanity, or whatever passes for humanity in an Orc and a half-dead space marine, in circumstances that sought to strip them of everything that made them individuals. Their story doesn't have a neat ending, because their story isn't over. Somewhere in the jungles of Corvus III, or perhaps on some other battlefield, they continue their existence, fighting when they must, talking when they can, navigating the impossible space between loyalty and friendship, duty and conscience, the roles they were built to fill, and the choices they make as individuals. If you enjoyed this story, if it made you think about the nature of friendship and duty and the choices we make when circumstances force impossible decisions, please consider liking and subscribing. Your support helps this channel continue exploring the deeper aspects of Warhammer 40K lore, the stories that make us question our assumptions about heroes and villains, good and evil, us and them. And remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with bolters and chainswords. Sometimes they're fought in quiet conversations between unlikely friends, in moments of understanding across impossible divides, in choices to see enemies as people, and people as worth understanding despite everything that teaches us not to. Thank you for listening. The Emperor protects, and sometimes, just sometimes, even orcs can be friends.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.